the Libertarian Contradiction, Anti-Monopoly Rhetoric, Monopolistic Foundations. Libertarianism presents itself as the ideology of competition. It condemns monopoly, denounces barriers to entry, and celebrates the movement of resources toward their most valued use. Yet at the core of its property system lies a principle that does exactly what it claims to oppose. It grants individuals exclusive control over resources, including the unilateral right to exclude others, even when exclusion results in a misallocation of capital. The issue is not monopoly itself. A monopoly is not inherently inefficient. If a single actor controls a resource because they are the most productive user of that resource, then concentration of control is not a problem. It is the efficient outcome. In this case, what appears as monopoly is simply the result of competitive forces selecting the highest productivity allocator of capital. The problem arises when monopoly leads to misallocation. That is, when a resource is controlled by an agent who is not the highest productivity user, yet others are prevented from accessing it due to enforced exclusion. At that point, monopoly ceases to be an outcome of competition and becomes a restriction on it. This is where the contradiction in libertarian property theory emerges. Under Lockean property, ownership is defined not merely as use, but as the absolute authority to determine who may use a resource and under what terms. This includes the right to refuse transfer entirely, regardless of whether another agent could deploy the resource more productively. Functionally, this grants the owner a monopoly over the resource. The libertarian defense is that property rights are necessary for coordination, investment, and long-term planning. But this defense does not address the central issue. The system provides no mechanism to ensure that control of resources remains aligned with highest productivity use over time. Instead, it guarantees that control persists with the current owner unless they voluntarily relinquish it. This creates a structural barrier to reallocation. If a higher productivity user cannot access a resource because the current owner refuses to transfer it or demands terms that exceed the efficiency gains from reallocation, then capital remains stuck in a lower productivity configuration. The result is deadweight loss. Total output is lower than it could be, not because of technological limits, but because of institutional constraints. At this point, the property right is no longer facilitating competition. It is restricting it. The comparison to intellectual property makes this clearer. Libertarians often criticize intellectual property laws for granting artificial monopolies, exclusive rights that prevent others from using ideas, even when doing so would increase total output. The objection is that such restrictions distort competition and create inefficiencies. But Lockean property operates on the same structural principle. It grants exclusive rights over physical resources, allowing owners to block higher productivity uses unless compensated on terms they control. In both cases, the right of exclusion can result in capital being withheld from more efficient deployment. The only difference is the domain, ideas versus physical assets. The mechanism is identical. This reveals the inconsistency. Libertarians oppose monopolies when they are imposed through regulation or intellectual property because these restrict competition. Yet they defend a property system that can produce the same outcome: persistent control over resources by less productive users protected from displacement. The defense that voluntary exchange will solve this is incomplete. Voluntary exchange depends on successful bargaining. But bargaining itself is subject to transaction costs, asymmetric information, and strategic holdout. If these frictions prevent reallocation, then the system fails to move resources to their highest productivity use, even when such a use exists. In other words, the market process can stall. At that point, monopoly is no longer the result of competitive success. It is the result of institutional rigidity. The deeper issue is that libertarianism treats property rights as fixed constraints rather than as instruments for optimizing capital allocation. Once exclusive control is treated as inviolable, the system loses its ability to correct misallocations dynamically. Competition becomes conditional on permission. If the goal is truly to maximize productivity, then no allocation of capital can be beyond challenge. Control over resources must remain contingent on continued productive use, not on historical claims or absolute rights of exclusion. Monopoly, in this framework, is acceptable when it reflects superior productivity. It becomes problematic when it prevents superior productivity from emerging. A system that cannot distinguish between these two cases and instead protects all exclusive control equally does not eliminate monopolies. It preserves inefficient ones. And in doing so, it contradicts its own commitment to competition.